You've already noticed that the freedom you think you have might just be a carefully constructed illusion, that your most intimate choices, your deepest desires, even the way you think about yourself, might not really be yours. Michel Foucault dedicated his life to revealing something so disturbing that many prefer not to see it. He showed that we live in an invisible prison, but unlike common prisons, this one has no wall, no bars. You can't see it because you are part of it. And the most terrifying thing, you help build it every day without realizing it. Today, I'm going to reveal what Foucault discovered about power, control, and the truth that no one wants you to know. But I have to warn you, once you see what he saw, there's no way to unsee it. So if you're ready to have your reality questioned, keep watching. But if you prefer the safety of your certainties, maybe it's better to stop now. Michel Foucault wasn't just a philosopher, he was what I call an archaeologist of consciousness. He dug deep into the layers of our society, not looking for ancient artifacts, but searching for the invisible mechanisms that shape how we think, how we act, and even how we see ourselves. And what he found was disturbing. He discovered that power doesn't work the way we were taught. We think of power as something that comes from above, from kings, presidents, bosses. Something that oppresses, that forces, that controls through violence. But Foucault showed that the most effective power is invisible. It doesn't need force because you exercise it on yourself. Imagine a prison where the prisoners watch each other, where there's no need for guards because each person has internalized the rules so deeply that they police themselves automatically. Foucault studied a real prison designed with this principle, the Panopticon, a circular structure where a central tower can observe all the cells, but the prisoners never know when they're being watched, so they act as if they're always being watched. The brilliant, or terrible, depending on how you see it, is that eventually you don't need the tower anymore. The prisoners have become their own guards. Now here's where it gets scary. Foucault realized that our entire society functions like a giant panopticon. Think about it. You're constantly policing yourself, not because someone is literally watching, but because you've internalized the gaze. You worry about what people will think. You adjust your behavior based on invisible norms. You censor yourself before you even speak. You are both the prisoner and the guard. And the most efficient thing about this system, it doesn't require any force. You keep it running voluntarily. Let me give you an example you can feel right now. Think about how you act on social media. You post something and immediately start checking the likes, comments, reactions. You start editing your next posts based on what gets approval. You create a version of yourself that is acceptable, that is approved. But who decided what is acceptable? You've internalized these rules so completely that you don't even question where they come from. You've become your own censor, your own controller. And that, Foucault would say, is power functioning in its purest and most insidious form. But Foucault went even deeper. He showed that this control system doesn't just shape your behavior, it shapes your identity. It creates who you think you are. You see, we like to think we have an essence, a true self that exists independently of the world around us. But Foucault argued that no such thing exists. You are a construction, a product of discourses, practices, and power systems that existed before you were born. Think about this. When you say, I am, what comes after? I am a man. I am a woman, I am heterosexual, I am successful, I am a failure. Where do these categories come from? Who created them? And more importantly, whom do they serve? Foucault showed that these identities are not natural, they are historical. They were invented at specific moments for specific reasons. And once you identify with one of these categories, you start behaving according to it. You start policing yourself to fit into it. Let me give you a concrete example. Foucault extensively studied the history of sexuality. He showed that the very idea of being homosexual or heterosexual didn't exist until recently in human history. In ancient Greece, people had sexual behaviors, but not sexual identities. You weren't homosexual. You simply did certain things. But in the 19th century, Doctors and psychiatrists began creating these categories. And once these categories existed, people began identifying with them. And once they identified, they began acting according to what was expected of those identities. Do you see the trap? Identity becomes a prison. You start limiting your behavior based on what is appropriate for your category. You start policing yourself, and everyone around you also starts policing you. Is this the man? Is this the woman? Is he acting appropriately for his orientation? Is she dressing according to her gender? It's a system of mutual surveillance where everyone is a guard and everyone is a prisoner. Now, here's where Foucault becomes really dangerous. He didn't stop there. He began questioning the very idea of truth. We like to think that truth is objective, universal, timeless, that science discovers truths that have always existed. But Foucault showed that what counts as truth changes over time. And more importantly, what counts as truth is always linked to power relations. He studied the history of madness. In the Middle Ages, people we see today as mentally ill were often seen as possessed by demons or touched by God. They had a certain status, a certain position in society. But then, with the Enlightenment, with the rise of reason, madness became something to be controlled, confined, cured. Asylums were built. Doctors gained the power to define what is normal and what is abnormal, and once they had that power, they could classify, diagnose, treat. But Foucault asked, who decides what is madness? Who decides what is sanity? And whom does this distinction serve? He showed that these medical categories are not just descriptive, they are prescriptive. They don't just describe how people are, they create how people should be. And once you're labeled as mad, as sick, as abnormal, you lose your voice. Your experience is disqualified. You become an object to be studied, controlled, corrected. The truth about you no longer comes from you. It comes from the experts who have the power to define you. And this applies to much more than just madness. Think about all the categories we use to define people: normal and abnormal, healthy and sick, productive and unproductive, legal and illegal. All these categories are presented as objective truths. But Foucault showed they are historical constructions. They were created at specific moments for specific reasons, and they serve specific interests. Comment if you've ever felt you're living according to standards you never chose. I see the script of my life. Here's something that will turn your mind upside down. Foucault showed that knowledge itself is a form of power. We like to think of knowledge as liberating. Knowledge is power, we say, meaning the more we know, the freer we are. But Foucault turned this upside down. He showed that knowledge is power not because it frees us, but because it controls us. Every field of knowledge creates categories, classifications, norms, and these norms define what is normal and what is deviant. They create the parameters within which you can exist. Think about medicine. Medicine creates categories of health and disease, and once these categories exist, you start measuring yourself against them. You go to the doctor, and he tells you your cholesterol is high, your blood pressure is elevated, your weight is above ideal, and suddenly, you become a patient. You become someone who needs to be treated, corrected, normalized. But who decided what normal cholesterol is? Who decided what ideal weight is? These norms change over time, and they're not neutral. They reflect cultural values, economic interests, power relations. Or think about psychology. Psychology creates categories of personality, development, normal and abnormal behavior. And once you're diagnosed with a disorder, it becomes your identity. You're no longer just a person with experiences. You're a depressive, an anxious person, a bipolar. And that label shapes how you see yourself, how others see you, what treatments you receive, what opportunities you have. Psychological knowledge doesn't just describe you, it creates you. Foucault called this disciplinary power. It's a power that operates through knowledge, through norms, through surveillance. And it's everywhere. In schools, where children are constantly evaluated, measured, compared to developmental norms. In hospitals, where bodies are examined, diagnosed, treated. In prisons, where behavior is monitored, recorded, modified. At work, where productivity is measured, performance is evaluated, efficiency is maximized. Even at home, where you measure yourself against ideal images of family, parenthood, success, and the most insidious thing, you participate voluntarily. You go to the doctor, you seek therapy, you submit to performance evaluations, you monitor your calories, your steps, your sleep through apps. You watch yourself, you measure yourself, you normalize yourself. Power doesn't need to force you because you exercise it on yourself. But here's where Foucault gets really profound. He wasn't just saying we're controlled. He was saying that the very idea of a self, of an identity, is a product of this power system. You think you have an essence, a true self that needs to be discovered or expressed. But Foucault argued that this self is a fabrication. It's something that was produced by all these discourses, practices, systems of knowledge and power. Think about how you came to know who you are. You went to school and learned about your abilities, your weaknesses. You were evaluated, tested, classified. You went to the doctor and received information about your body, your health. You may have gone to a therapist who helped you understand your psychology, your traumas, your patterns. You read books, watched movies, absorbed cultural messages about what it means to be a man or woman, successful or failed, normal or different. And through all this, you were building a narrative about who you are. But Foucault would say this narrative isn't yours. It was given to you. The ingredients of this story came from outside. The categories, the concepts, the values, all of this is cultural, historical, contingent. You think you're discovering your true identity, but you're actually building an identity from materials that society provided. Now, this may sound nihilistic. If there's no true self, if everything is constructed, then what remains? But here's Foucault's radical turn. He said that recognizing yourself is a construction isn't depressing, it's liberating. Because if you're constructed, then you can reconstruct yourself. If there's no fixed essence, then you have freedom to create yourself. Foucault called this practices of freedom or care of the self. The idea is that once you understand your identity isn't fixed, that it's a product of historical and social forces, you can begin working on yourself in new ways. You can question the norms you've internalized. You can experiment with different ways of being. You can become a work of art. But, and this is crucial, Foucault wasn't talking about superficial self-help. He wasn't saying just be yourself or think positive. He was talking about deep and difficult work, of questioning everything you assume about yourself, of dismantling the power structures that operate through you, of resisting the subtle forms of control you've internalized. Let me give you a concrete example. Say you grow up in a society that values material success above all. You internalize this. You define your identity in terms of your career, your salary, your possessions. You measure yourself against these standards. You feel good when you're progressing and miserable when you're not. But then you start questioning, where does this definition of success come from? Whom does it serve? Why did I accept this as truth? And you start experimenting with different values. Maybe you value creativity or relationships or contribution to community. And in doing so, you start creating yourself anew. But here's the part Foucault always emphasized. This freedom is never complete. You never completely escape power relations. There's no place outside the system where you can stand. You're always within networks of power, always being shaped by discourses and practices. Freedom isn't absence of power. It's a different relationship with power. It's the capacity to recognize how power operates through you and resist, modify, subvert those operations. Foucault said that where there is power, there is resistance. Power isn't a monolithic thing that crushes everything. It's a relation, and relations can be changed. There are always spaces for maneuvering, points of resistance, possibilities of acting otherwise. The goal isn't to destroy all power, which would be impossible. The goal is to be constantly vigilant, constantly questioning, constantly refusing the forms of power that limit you. Comment if you've started questioning the norms you always accepted. I see the chains now. Now let me take this to an even deeper level. Foucault studied what he called governmentality. This is the idea that in modern society, power doesn't function primarily through repression or violence. It functions through management, administration, optimization of life. The goal isn't to punish or kill, but to make live, make produce, make be efficient. Think about how modern government functions. It doesn't just prohibit things. It encourages behaviors. It creates public health programs to make people live longer. It implements educational policies to make the population more productive. It manages the economy to maximize growth. All this seems benevolent, right? The government wants you to be healthy, educated, prosperous. But Foucault pointed out the dark side. All these interventions require knowledge about the population. They require statistics, surveys, surveillance. The government needs to know how many people are sick, where they are, what diseases they have. It needs to know education levels, employment rates, consumption patterns. And to obtain this knowledge, it needs to monitor, measure, record. And you as an individual become a data point. Your life is transformed into information that can be managed. And here's where it gets really interesting. This type of power doesn't just act on you from outside. It teaches you to act on yourself. You become responsible for your own health. You must exercise, eat well, get regular checkups. You become responsible for your own education. You must learn continuously, develop skills, remain employable. You become responsible for your own financial security. You must save, invest, plan for retirement. And if you fail, if you get sick, if you become unemployed, if you become poor, well, it's your fault. You didn't manage yourself adequately. You didn't make the right decisions. You see how this works? The system transfers responsibility to you, and in doing so, it hides the larger structures of power, inequality, injustice that actually shape your life. Foucault called this neoliberalism, though the concept applies more broadly. It's the idea that you must become an entrepreneur of yourself. You must manage yourself like a company. Maximize your human capital, invest in yourself, optimize your performance, and every social interaction becomes a transaction. Every relationship becomes a network. Every activity becomes an investment. Think about how this manifests today. You don't just work, you build your personal brand. You don't just socialize, you network. You don't just live, you optimize. Every moment is an opportunity to improve, to grow, to become more valuable. Even your free time is productive. You exercise to improve your health. You read to improve your mind. You meditate to improve your efficiency. And what happens when you can't keep up the pace? When you feel exhausted, anxious, depressed? Well, there are apps for that. Online therapy, mindfulness, life coaching, all these tools to help you manage yourself better, to optimize yourself more effectively. You never escape the imperative to improve yourself. You become your own endless project. Foucault would say this is power in its most refined form. It doesn't need to force you. You force yourself. It doesn't need to control you. You control yourself. It doesn't need to punish you. You punish yourself when you don't meet the expectations you've internalized. It's a system of domination so complete, it looks like freedom. But here's the hope. Foucault always insisted that understanding how power works is the first step to resisting it. If you can see the mechanisms, you can start interfering with them. If you can recognize the norms you've internalized, you can start questioning them. If you can identify the discourses that constitute you, you can start speaking in other ways. So how do you do this? How do you practice freedom in a world saturated with power? Foucault offers some directions, though he always resisted giving definitive answers. First, practice what he called critical attitude. Question everything. Don't accept anything as natural, inevitable, or necessary. Always ask, why this? Why now? Whom does this serve? How could this be different? This critical attitude applies to everything, to laws, social norms, identity categories, scientific truths, even your own beliefs and desires. Second, cultivate what Foucault called care of the self. But don't confuse this with superficial self-care. It's not about bubble baths and affirmations. It's about deep ethical work of creating yourself as a moral subject. subject. It's about deciding what kind of person you want to be and practicing ways of living that take you in that direction, not based on external rules or social expectations, but based on your own careful, ethical reflection. Third, experiment. Foucault saw life as a work of art in progress. You don't discover who you are, you create who you are. And like any artist, you experiment, fail, try again. You test different ways of living, different relationships, different practices. You allow yourself to be fluid, multiple, contradictory. You resist the urge to fix yourself into a stable identity. Fourth, find spaces of resistance. Foucault studied what he called heterotopias, other spaces where the normal rules of society are suspended or inverted. These could be alternative communities, social movements, cultural practices, relationships that operate by different logics. In these spaces, you can experiment with other forms of living, other forms of relating, other forms of being. Fifth, speak truth to power, but recognize that truth itself is contested. Foucault believed in the importance of what he called parrhesia, speaking frankly, especially when it's risky. This means saying what you see even when it contradicts dominant narratives. But it also means recognizing that your truth is partial, situated, contingent. It's not the truth. It's one truth among many. Now, you might be thinking, this all sounds exhausting, and you're right. Foucault doesn't offer an easy way out. He doesn't offer a solution. He offers a practice of living, a way of being constantly vigilant, constantly questioning, constantly working on yourself. It's difficult, it's uncomfortable, but Foucault would argue it's the only way to live a life that is genuinely yours, rather than simply following a script written by forces you never examined. And here's something crucial Foucault always emphasized. This isn't a solitary journey. You can't do this alone. You need others who are also questioning, experimenting, resisting. Foucault was deeply engaged in social movements, in collective struggles for justice. He believed personal transformation and social transformation are inextricably linked. You can't change yourself without changing the structures around you, and you can't change the structures without changing yourself. So find your co-conspirators, the people who also see through the illusions, who are also tired of playing roles, who also want to create different ways of living. Together you can experiment, support each other, create spaces where other forms of life are possible. But let me give you a warning. This journey has a cost. Once you start questioning, it's hard to stop. Once you start seeing the mechanisms of power, you see them everywhere. Once you start denaturalizing norms, you feel alienated from people who still accept them without question. You might feel lonely. You might feel marginalized. You might be seen as problematic, difficult, dangerous. Foucault lived this. He was marginalized for his sexuality, for his politics, for his radical ideas. He often felt like an outsider, even in academic circles, but he embraced this position. He saw that being on the margins gives you a perspective that those in the center don't have. You can see what they can't see, because they're too invested in the system. So if you find yourself on the margins, don't see this as failure. See it as opportunity. An opportunity to see clearly, an opportunity to live otherwise, an opportunity to contribute to transforming the world in ways that those comfortably in the center never will. Now let me bring this back to you, to your life. Why does this matter? Why should you care about the ideas of a French philosopher who died decades ago? Because everything Foucault said is even more relevant today than it was in his time. We live in an era of unprecedented surveillance. Every click, every purchase, every movement is tracked, recorded, analyzed. Algorithms predict your behavior, shape your choices, create bubbles that reinforce what you already believe. You're constantly encouraged to optimize yourself, to measure yourself, to compare yourself. Your life has become data, and that data is used to manage you, to sell you things, to influence you. At the same time, identity categories have multiplied. There are more labels than ever to describe who you are. And on one hand, this can seem liberating. Finally, there's language for your experience. But from what Foucault taught us, we must always ask, do these categories free me or imprison me? Do they allow me to be who I am, or do they force me to fit into predefined boxes? Do they connect me with others, or do they create new forms of dividing and categorizing? And think about politics today. Foucault taught us that power isn't just about who governs. It's about how you are governed. It's about the subtle ways your behavior is shaped, your choices are limited, your freedom is administered. So it's not enough just to change the leaders. You have to change the structures, the discourses, the practices that produce certain types of subjects and certain forms of life. Comment if you're ready to question everything. I choose to see. So what do you do with all this? You start small. You start paying attention. You start noticing the moments when you police yourself, the moments when you adjust yourself to fit in, the moments when you accept something as truth without questioning. And each time you notice, you pause, you ask why. You experiment with doing it differently, not dramatically, just a little differently, and you see what happens. You start examining the narratives you tell about yourself. Where do they come from? Which parts are really yours, and which parts did you absorb from others? You start playing with different identities, different ways of describing yourself, different relationships with your past and future. You allow yourself to be contradictory, inconsistent, multiple. You start questioning the norms around you, at work, at home, in your relationships, not necessarily rejecting everything, but asking, does this serve me? Does this contribute to the life I want to live? Or is it just something that's always been done this way? And when you identify norms that limit you, you start gently transgressing them. You look for spaces and people that allow experimentation, where you can try different ways of being without judgment, where you can fail and try again, where you can be fluid instead of fixed. And you offer this to others too. You create spaces where they can question, experiment, resist, and perhaps most importantly, you cultivate what Foucault called courage of truth, the willingness to say what you see, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it puts you at risk, even when it marks you as problematic. Because silence, Foucault taught us, is complicity. When you see injustice and don't speak, you're keeping the system running, but you speak strategically. You choose your moments, you find your words, you recognize that truth isn't a sledgehammer, it's a surgical tool, and you use it carefully, with compassion, with attention to context and consequences. This is the work. It's not glamorous, it's not easy, it doesn't end. It's a daily practice of vigilance, questioning, experimentation, resistance. But Foucault would say it's the only work that truly matters, because it's the work of becoming free, not free from power relations, which is impossible, but free within them, capable of navigating, modifying, subverting the forces that shape you. And here's the beauty of it. When you do this work, you don't just transform yourself, you transform the world around you. Because every time you resist a norm, you weaken its power. Every time you live differently, you create an example for others. Every time you speak truth, you open space for others to speak too. Change doesn't come from a single dramatic revolution. It comes from 1,000 small acts of resistance, from 1,000 experiments in living otherwise. Foucault never promised it would be easy. He never promised it would be comfortable. But he promised it would be real, that it would be yours, that it would be a life lived consciously instead of a life lived on autopilot. And in the end, isn't that what we all want? A life that is genuinely ours? A life that isn't just the reproduction of inherited patterns, but an original creation. So this video only appears when you're ready. Ready to see what no one sees, ready to question what everyone accepts, ready to live differently, even when it's hard. If you've made it this far, you're already ready. You've already started to see. Now the question is, what are you going to do with what you've seen? Foucault left us with a question that each of us must answer, not with words, but with our lives. The question is this: what kind of person do you want to be? Not what kind of person society wants you to be. Not what kind of person you were taught to be, but what kind of person you, in your deepest, most honest reflection, want to become. And then, how are you going to practice becoming that person? What experiments will you make? What resistances will you offer? What truths will you speak? This is the ethical task Foucault left us. Not following rule, not obeying authorities, but creating yourself as a work of art, making your life a practice of freedom. and in doing so, contributing to a world where more forms of life are possible, where more truths can be spoken, where more people can be free. If this video resonated with you, if you recognize something of yourself in these ideas, then be part of this journey. Subscribe to this channel where we explore the deepest and most dangerous ideas of philosophy. The ideas that don't give you easy answers, but equip you with the tools to live a conscious, questioning, free life. Turn on the bell so you don't miss the next videos, and comment below, what do you see now that you didn't see before? What norms are you ready to question? What experiments will you make in your life? Remember, Foucault said, freedom is a practice. It's not something you have, it's something you do. So go out and practice. Question, experiment, resist, create. And know that in doing this, you're not alone. There are others out there doing the same work, living the same questions, and together we're creating a world where more is possible, where more can be said, where more can be lived. Thank you for watching. See you in the next dimension.